Hi, welcome to an episode of the Jet Rails podcast. I'm Robert, your host. Today we're going to be talking about accessibility. And it's a particularly interesting topic as, we're always trying to focus in the web industry and e-commerce on how can we improve the flow through a website? How can we increase conversions? How can we make sure that we're speaking to the folks that get to our website in a healthy way and attract more. And it's, I think, been a long journey so far to really address accessibility for all users. And so today's guest from Essential Accessibility, Simon, is going to be able to bring us up to speed on a lot of what's going on around accessibility and compliance in the market to be able to service the widest range of shoppers and customers and website visitors as possible. Something that I'm excited to see finally becoming more mainstream in the market. It's, as they say, a long road. And Simon, with that, would you do the honors of introducing yourself?
Hi, thank you, Robert. Hello to all your listeners. My name is Simon Dermer. I'm co-founder and CEO of Essential Accessibility. What we offer is effectively what we pioneered and known as accessibility as a service. We support digital teams and organizations in their efforts to ensure that their digital assets both achieve and maintain compliance on an ongoing basis, and we enhance the customer experience to ensure that no one with a disability is left behind, and that in the promotion of inclusion, experiences can be enjoyed by everyone, regardless of ability.
And, Simon, I figure it's probably good to break that down a little bit. I certainly have personal experience with helping sites with accessibility way back when in my agency days. But what types of accessibility are we talking about when we talk about improving websites and addressing the needs of this wider audience?
Sure. And taking it back a step further, we look at the brick and mortar world, we think of the word accessibility, what comes to mind? Commonly, wheelchairs, motor scooters, ramps into buildings. We see braille now on elevator buttons, white canes. Those are the brick and mortar uh, objects and images that we associate with what accessibility is. Moving now to the digital world, and as we all know, especially your audience, everything is increasingly digital. Uh, the experience for people with various sensory and physical limitations can be compromised in these contexts. For example, one that will resonate quite obviously is if you're a person with limited hearing or a type of hearing impairment. Obviously, if you can't hear the audio on this podcast, that's going to be compromise the experience. That's why we have things like captioning and subtitles and various tools and strategies to deal with that. Someone is physically challenged. Think of the late Stephen Hawking. We've all seen images of him with this elaborate device that allowed him to control his computer without the use of his hands. He had motor neuron disease, ALS. Nevertheless, Intel had designed him this elaborate system that allowed him to overcome these physical limitations to interact with the computer, much as any typical user would. When you look at issues of vision impairment, this is a more nuanced issue, but a very, very compelling one. If you close your eyes and you imagine, how would I interact with a website? Well, there are things called screen readers, which will read text and will read what's on the screen to any user. So when you think of the screen reader following the text on the web page, you would want it to read exactly what a trained visual eye would see if it were reading the text visually. But the thing is, the screen reader doesn't read the text on the web page, it reads the code that informs the text on the web page. And more often than not, actually in the overwhelming majority of cases, the vast majority of websites, that code is very, very mangled. So when the screen reader is trying to follow the text in a bouncy ball type format, it's really just jumping all over the page and reading gobbledygook. And it's all being speech outputted in a manner that is highly unintelligible to the website visitor. So people who are vision impaired are effectively shut out on a site like this from the experience. They can't absorb the information. The information is not actionable. They can't go to the checkout. They can't do their banking. So it's very, very critical that this be redressed, that this be remedied in some fashion. And that's what digital accessibility is about. It's addressing these facets of the experience for different disabilities. And it's not limited to just those three. Another one as well are cognitive or neurodiversity related issues. When you think of dyslexia, you can have epilepsy. There are a range of cognitive issues that can be impaired and can be challenged depending on how information is conveyed, the way it's laid out, the colors, the lights, the flashing, the color contrast, all those things affect the experience. When you put it all together, digital accessibility is about ensuring that when you launch a digital asset, you factor the needs of all these personas, all these users, and you have a process in place to address them. And that process, it's a complex undertaking to address all these various requirements. If you do it unassisted and unaided, you're not going to be able to achieve it as a developer. But with a platform like Essential Accessibility, like ours that we've developed, it's all about giving you the guideposts and the inputs to inform the coding decision making that's taking place to ensure that the final generated output, the delivered digital asset, meets these minimum compliance requirements and actually goes beyond to ensure that the needs of all these users has been maximally factored and taken into consideration.
So, there's a few things happening here in terms of the results. So obviously, the site is becoming more accessible to more people. What, in terms of the merchant and the e-commerce website owners, what is actually happening for them at the tail end once they do this properly and well? What kind of expectation should they have? Are there, variety of fringe benefits? Like, I know back in the day, we would want to fill out alt tags for images to add text to represent, to describe what an image was about, no matter what, for SEO purposes. Do you find that once a website goes through a stringent process, that there are metrics that are being hit or benefits that are being seen pretty reliably?
Well, let's take a step back even before that, and let's talk about the disability market in general. One of the things we do when we speak to organizations is we say, we know you're looking at this more commonly than not because of the regulatory requirement. Maybe you've been hit with a lawsuit, a demand letter, but we want to remind them that there are many, many more reasons to do this than the short-term element of getting the lawsuit off your back. And what we highlight is the fact that, first of all, about 1 in 5 individuals around the world self-identifies as having a disability. So that's 20% of the population. That's over 1 billion people around the world. That's a huge market. So you would certainly want to, if you're a business, if you're a government, if you're a service provider, you want to reach the maximum audience possible. So this is a very, very large audience.
Number two, look, and if you add up, so even if you cut out from that, let's say, some of the people that have disabilities related to, walking and movement, things that we were talking about that affect brick and mortar, even if you just pull that down to auditory and visual and cognitive and some of the things we've been talking about, it's still a huge number.
Sure, and you're getting to another point, is the fact that not everybody with a disability has problems getting on a website. You could be missing both your legs and be a user of a motor scooter, and you're surfing the web, no problem. So it's certainly a subset of people with disabilities. But the important factor to recognize is, as a brand that is out there trying to get your products and your services and your message, you want to be seen to be a disability friendly brand. So promoting accessibility isn't just about the individual user using it for a certain product or feature. It's about sending a message that I'm a brand that understands the needs. I am listening to you. I am here to empower you as a customer. And that is what informs the impact. It's the fact that it's the commitment. Organizations like Walt Disney, for example, which are just renowned for doing disability well, when they, for instance, hold an autism friendly day. Oh, sorry, that's the movie theaters. If they have I think they do an autism friendly day.
They
And
do a lot around
yes,
autism,
yeah,
so that would make sense.
yeah, they'll have disability themed days at the park, and people think, well, that's great. They'll attract that individual, but Disney's sending a bigger message than it's about more than just the short term need that's being fulfilled of servicing that individual. It's about families are having an experience to come together. It's about recognizing that by doing all this all together, it sends a message to their employees internally. It's
I mean, inclusion is huge. And I think that in our lifetimes, we've seen inclusion go from, uh, something that wasn't really at the forefront to something that we think more cognitively about, that we care more about as societies, and that I think we can all be proud of. But that there's still, like so many things that we should take some pride in. We haven't achieved, I think, the full scope of what we can and what we should. And so that's really interesting I guess inclusion being there not only to increase sales and to service a market, but also to speak to the larger uh, population and to represent a business as inclusive and uh, as a company that cares. We had an episode a few months back where we looked at an agency that became a publicly certified B Corp, a public service corporation. And I think it's particularly interesting. It's a for-profit. It's not that they were, there are B Corps that are on the stock exchanges. It's not that that it's always about being a nonprofit, but at the same time, you can think about the greater good. And I think that's really, an interesting movement happening, even in our for-profit and very capitalist sectors, where we're trying to bring these things together. And I think shoppers more than ever care. And there are, generations that really shop based on some of these things first, based on the identity of who they're giving their money to. They're voting with their dollars. So I'm with you 100% there. That's absolutely, for me, at the forefront of all of this.
Sure. So once organizations recognize there's this market, disability friendly brand, they realize all these efforts that we need to put into various areas address certain needs of certain individuals, and there's no one all encompassing across the board solution that is going to single handedly address the needs of the entire disability community. It's collectively you're bringing them all together. And now, as we look now to the digital environment, as we know, things are increasingly devolving and being moved to the digital channels. COVID exacerbated that. In particular, you could no longer go to a restaurant during the lockdowns. You could no longer go to a bank branch. It was digital or nothing. You couldn't go to school. You couldn't do a Zoom call. So it really highlighted the importance of ensuring that these channels remain available to everybody, regardless of their ability. And so when you look at now, you're asking in particular around when you make these improvements to your site, the alt tag example, it's a common example because any developer can relate to it. The idea of putting a tag on an image that provides a descriptor that informs the user of what's taking place in the image. So if someone's blind, the screen reader gets to the image. Very, very important that descriptor be there. Otherwise, the information that's conveyed in the photo will not be clear to them. Pretty straightforward thing to do. Unfortunately, again, it's a practice that's woefully very poorly followed or adhered to. But it's an example of a very simple fix on a site that you don't need a lot of expertise to implement. You also touched on the benefits of SEO. We don't like to use SEO as the motivation to do accessibility because one, it's a difficult thing to really prove, to really demonstrably show, well, how is my SEO is a very nebulous activity in its own right, and we're not SEO specialists. And the SEO game is very dynamic. The motivation to promote accessibility is serving this market of people with disabilities, and that should, in and of itself, be sufficient. But nevertheless, there is an SEO benefit, and it's been conveyed to me in the following manner: Google is the biggest blind searcher on the planet. In other words, the Google crawler is, think of it as a blind individual, eyes closed, or that is going out and scouring the world for information, gathering it, consolidating it. So the more usable the format that it's placed in, which is all SEO practices, if that image has a clear descriptor on it, if you're following all these accessibility best practices, well, then that blind web crawling search engine is going to do a better job of being able to categorize and label information and index it. So yes, there's an SEO benefit. One more reason to get on the accessibility train and to justify the expense of it.
Yeah, and you already mentioned compliance, and so there's the forward-thinking way of looking at this, but then the other side is risk analysis, of course. And what are some of the risks of not being compliant, and how serious are some of these legal letters and and outreach from attorneys and other things that some merchants and businesses run into?
The risks are there. Last year alone, there were 11,000 lawsuits in the U.S. around digital accessibility. So that's a pretty large number, which also suggests that there could have been 50,000 to 100,000 legal demand letters. We don't have a metric on that because it's not cataloged, but we certainly know for every lawsuit, there are way more demand letters that are involved. So the legal impetus has arrived. There's many of these lawsuits the plaintiffs have different motivations. Some of the lawsuits are completely legitimate based on a user being squeezed out and having a compromised experience. A lot of them are frivolous drive-by lawsuits, nuisance suits, where the site hasn't even been necessarily evaluated. But whatever the status or the case, the bottom line is there's one more legal impetus there. It's invoking the regulatory body that's urging organizations to adhere to a certain standard, follow a certain level of best practices. And so you put all these forces, the confluence of factors together, and it really just points at all the in one direction, and that it's time to really start to do something about this if you haven't done it yet. And unfortunately, we're seeing the market really maturing in terms of the awareness of this. We're past that stage of awareness, and now organizations are searching for solutions. They're realizing that there are a number of paths they can take to doing this. A lot of them are attended by much frustrations or great costs or inefficiencies, and they're looking for the optimal ways that best suit their organization to effectively embed this into their development process and to make it an ongoing practice.
It's interesting that I think it relates a lot when we talk in our industry about PCI compliance. And if you accept credit cards, you have to adhere to standards from the payment card industry, PCI. And that's important. You don't want to be risking fines and suits and other all sorts of other issues, or being shut down in some way in terms of your ability to accept payment cards. But that's not the number one. That those standards don't describe by detail exactly how to keep your website secure. Similarly, the number one reason to keep your website secure probably shouldn't be to avoid fines and suits. It should really be to protect your business, to protect your customers from negative experience, because it's not just that somebody's going to sue you. You're going to feel some pain of having your site negatively impacted. That you can really damage your brand and have other things. We've touched on the topic through other episodes and other content, but I think that it's interesting that there's that duality to it, that there's the regulatory bodies, and there's also doing the right thing. And of course, one is more meant to just give you that extra push in the right direction. But at the same time, what is anybody waiting for? That whether it's security or whether it's something like accessibility, it just makes sense that it's hard to get somebody that's anti accessibility, I would imagine, or just like it's hard to get someone that's anti security. It's just about getting them to stop and address it. Would that kind of jive with the way that you have conversations with merchants and others in the industry? They just haven't gotten to it yet, or they didn't realize what they were missing or how to achieve it?
There are a lot of reasons. This is the legacy reason. There's the statistical reason. People think that disability is, as I mentioned earlier, it's a wheelchair or a white cane. So when they go out in the brick and mortar world and they see one person in a wheelchair in a given week, they think, well, there aren't that many people with disabilities out there. How important is this anyway? And they don't understand, well, only a small percentage of people with disabilities use motor scooters or wheelchairs. And there's some 60% of disabilities are hidden. You can't see it. So they underestimate, first of all, the size of the market. Then they might make an assumption that, well, people with disabilities, they don't have any money. They don't have this kind of spending. And the truth there is the fact that on the socioeconomic ladder, on average, yes, the income of an average person with disability is going to be lower than someone who isn't living with a disability, and that arises from the fact that the employment rate is lower in the disability community, which is another social imbalance that is being continually redressed to restore equity in that domain. But nevertheless, the disability market still has a massive spend. Everyone still needs to eat and clothe and get transportation, and so it's all predicated on this false assumption that it's not worth the attention. The flip side of that is the legacy of model of brick and mortar. There were significant investments that had to be made to create an accommodation, to create an accessible environment. If you think of the cost of an independent restaurateur putting in one wheelchair accessible bathroom on a street where there's no ramp, I mean, that could be a very sizable investment and to a business that's already struggling. And so there were true financial barriers to retrofitting the brick and mortar world to accommodate and address everyone's disability. I mean, it just wasn't feasible in these circumstances, in every circumstance. Yet when you look at the digital world, one website can serve $1 trillion organization. So when you spread that cost over all those 5,000 restaurants that could be associated with that one restaurant, you can see that, wow, now a little bit of investment in accessibility, the cost of retrofitting that one washroom in one restaurant in the digital world can make their whole digital experience accessible to everybody with any disability. So you can see that it's becoming much more efficient to address, prioritize accessibility initiatives and ensure that experiences can accommodate and be experienced enjoyably by everyone equally.
Yeah. And, so there are huge companies out there, the Amazons of the world, that have some pretty significant coffers to tap into when they want to improve something or when they want to be forward thinking. When it comes to the rest of the market, mid-market businesses, perhaps, companies that are up and running, that have customers, do a lot of the same rules really apply in your mind? Is it achievable on the same level to address accessibility in a pretty holistic way? And what does some of that look like? I know we've talked about organizing content in a way that systems can read it for people that can't see it themselves, and we've talked about tagging images and such. What else goes into that? So what does the market look like today in terms of there are these up and running businesses and they should be more accessible? What's actually really feasible and happening today?
Yeah, that's a good question, because not all websites are created equally. I mean, the vast majority could be blog sites or one person part-time managed versus small business. You could have the local Chinese restaurant, that has a very basic website through to obviously we get the mid-market into the enterprise level. So you have different.
Yeah, I mean, little Susie's lemonade stand isn't exactly putting
Well,
in a wheelchair ramp, for better or worse.
little Susie who's paying $8 a month for a site. Yes, the expense. That's why the affordability of solutions. One of the challenges in the accessibility space is automation. Automation, you would intuitively think, is the answer to addressing this challenge. But the problem is automation can only address about 30% of the types of errors that afflict a typical digital asset. And that's what I'm talking about. Not even a typical digital asset. That's what I'm talking about. A responsive website. And forget other assets that are more esoteric or unique. So it's a challenge. You need to have human involvement. You need to have technical expertise, and that is not going to be within the reach of the smallest businesses. But there are many, many things that can be done to elevate and enhance the experience further. It may not achieve complete compliance in every specific instance, but if developers educate themselves, if they make use of some of the tools, there are open source tools, if they get some feedback, you can certainly do many, many things that will improve that experience and can move them along the curve further at a very, very low cost. But yes, if you've got many assets, complex assets, you're going to need, like any organization of a certain size, you're going to absolutely need a third party vendor to help you with that.
And
Building a team.
I'm gonna flip that over for a second. Within these established businesses, that they're up and running, they've got hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue, millions of dollars in annual revenue online, in some cases more, and I suppose in some cases going up toward enterprise organizations. What types of people in the organization should be involved in accessibility, as well as compliance? Who is typically tasked with addressing these issues within an organization? Is it a mix of people from developers to merchandisers to to business owners and e-commerce managers and such, or do you typically find that there's a few people that need to deal with a few key tasks, especially for things that are more manual in order to do them well, that require some writing and some forethought?
Responsibility is going to lie with the compliance officer or GC. I mean, ultimately, if there's a problem, it's going to land on their desk. So it's on their radar to various degrees. Maybe they're not hearing about it till it's too late, but the proactive ones are getting ahead of it and ensuring their organizations are adhering to these mandates. Chief digital officers, it's gonna fall within their purview. Now, the day-to-day of managing the accessibility, that's typically going to be assigned someone on the digital team. We're increasingly seeing in the larger organizations accessibility coordinators who are being tasked with the responsibility of coordinating and ensuring deadlines are being met. Digital teams are adhering to and following the practices and the guidelines and the guidance they're receiving from solutions providers like ourselves. We offer a platform that's leveraged and the developers take advantage of, so they basically, it's a roadmap telling them what they need to do, and it's giving them the feedback at each step of the way to make sure that code that is going live and launching is ensuring that it's all in the service of delivering a product that's going to be accessible to everybody. Yeah. So it's digital. I mean, ultimately, it's the people who are building the assets themselves. When you look at documents, though, PDFs, quite often you might have an owner that isn't a digital expert. They're a content creator who just happens to be publishing it in a format, and they've got to adhere to accessibility requirements. That can be, to a certain extent, a user as well that's going to need help. That's very ad hoc, like one piece of content at a time. But the main experiences the users are encountering today it's at the website level of large organizations. Mm-hmm. Ordering a pizza, doing your banking, booking your healthcare appointment, mobile apps, going and ordering your delivered food. These are the big, if you look at where we're spending the average user spending their time, it's fulfilling those basic needs. Instacart,
Well,
getting your groceries, those are the priority areas now. And within those experiences, the priorities are being able to do the minimal things you need to do to get your groceries. So
and it's interesting you mentioned PDFs and documents that if you're a manufacturer and you've got sell sheets, manuals, guides, other things, on your product pages or within your site, those are additional pieces of content that should follow some additional best practice that, sometimes as businesses grow, we all forget about just how many assets there are that need to be handled properly. So, I'm once one of these sites becomes compliant, I imagine that there's for an existing website that there's that heavy, lifting up the mountain, just like with other initiatives like SEO that we talked about or other things to, make sure things are properly tagged and in the right order and so on. And once that happens, how much work does it take comparatively for maintenance to continue to stay compliant? I imagine that the rules and the technology of compliance don't change tremendously over time. I'm sure that there's some evolution still happening, but that is it mostly about just addressing new products and new content in a healthy way moving forward, so that as you add and adjust, that you're continuing to address it, or is there any other kind of maintenance or cleanup to properly stay compliant and stay on top of accessibility?
in the good old days, the attitude was, well, I built my website, it's done, and we're never going to have to build another website. There's this finality in this staticness to digital assets that gave everybody the impression that it was a punctuated event, whether it was creating the asset or even accessibility. As we all know now, digital assets are continually being innovated. New ones are appearing all the time in an organization, and they're dynamic. And they're dynamic in many respects. The content's being refreshed, the messaging is being refreshed, and the interoperability of the new technologies, a new browser versions coming out. It needs to play nice with this plugin. If the fact that as long as you have a digital team, you're going to need to be addressing accessibility. So, in unless you're someone that believes that your digital team can be let go and they can go home because your digital assets are all there,
that's that's a good way of looking at
yeah,
it.
just to beat
Yeah.
yourself with the notion that accessibility is one and done. Like, it's ongoing the same way your digital is ongoing. Think of it as a quality assurance step in an ongoing final quality assurance step in the process before you're launching and maintaining any assets. So certainly the element of retrofitting a portfolio of assets versus maintaining them, well, that's got a lot of upfront work. You're getting on the train, you're building up your momentum. But once you've achieved the momentum, you've overcome that initial inertia. Well, at that stage, the maintenance is going to be a lot more. If you're always building and launching with accessibility in mind, then the lifting is never going to be heavy. It's always going to be just light, ongoing work. But if you're trying to go back and retrofit stuff, I mean, that's going to be it.
Yeah, you got to get up the mountain at that point. Maintaining base camp's not as hard, but I suppose it's the same way that in my day to day we talk about security and loading speed optimization and scalability of sites. That as you add new extensions, plugins, modules, add-ons, as you update other files in your site, as your database grows, as as your server software gets updated, all these things are happening as you add new product images and other things that that may have scaling issues. As other facets are moving, you need to load test and make sure that your site can still handle the same amount of traffic, that some bottleneck didn't get added in, that you have to keep tracking your loading speed, that just because your loading speed was at 2 seconds last month doesn't automatically mean that it'll be at 2 seconds moving forward as your site keeps evolving. And security for sure is just a moving target that you always have to keep your eye on the ball. So it was that this gets added to that checklist. that requires some ongoing, but just like security, when you have everything properly locked down, you're running good scans, you're staying on top of it, that the footprint to continue to stay secure when you've got all the right tools and systems should be a lot more manageable. The same with these other things. If your site was able to handle a certain amount of traffic, you may have introduced a bottleneck, but clearing that bottleneck, you've already gotten everything else where it needs to be. So, and speed the same. So I think that's an interesting way of looking at it, that it's pretty par for the course for what these businesses that are properly addressing these issues, I suppose, use as a normal cadence and expectation.
Yeah, the digital teams never sleep. I mean, there's always work
Never.
to do, and
Never. Well, and and there are these these larger tasks of catching up on something, or really addressing something new, and then there's maintenance to stay where you need to be. And early in the episode, we talked a little bit about some of the different disabilities that require some forethought and some work to address. Are there any that you find that are still tough to support online, that you think that we might see strides in the next few years, that really the software is still being improved, or maybe there's only a very small percentage of players in the market that are really addressing it well, and you think it'll come more toward a wider swath of the market?
I can tell you this: addressing cognitive limitations is very challenging, just because they're so nuanced, they're so subtle. One person could require vocabulary written at a level of a certain grade, and another person requires something else. So there's a bit of conflict between addressing different ones in the cognitive realm. So that's certainly an area of big challenge. When we get into the more uniform, homogeneous type of limitations, let's go back to that example of the alt tag. We're seeing some progress being made on the AI front in terms of the ability to label an image. So let's imagine there's an image of a boy throwing a ball in a picture, and AI has now demonstrated the ability, excuse me, AI has now demonstrated the ability to potentially label that image based on a training data set. So that's an advancement, that's progress. So if you're an organization with millions of photos and going back to label them all, you could run an AI program through and do it. The problem is, though, the context of the image may not be a boy throwing a ball. It may be the backdrop to the image. It may be the context in which the image is juxtaposed with the text. So the problem is meaning. The AI cannot pick up the meaning in any means. So that's why automation is so limited in what it can do. You can only test currently about 30% of the types of errors that could arise through automated means. And so if you can't even test more than 30%, how could you even fix that many? You can't fix what you can't test. So what we're seeing is a preponderance of these solutions on the market that are purporting to be able to be one flip of the switch type solutions that can instantly test all the errors and fix all the errors. And it's a bunch of chicanery. Like, it's not able to do it. It's just preying on consumers or businesses that don't really know any better, on the promised hope of satisfying this requirement. And the reality is it just can't be done.
Well, I think that the SEO world has tried to do that for years. And, if you just try to let automation determine the content on your website, yeah, it might help your rankings a little bit. But, when someone actually comes and reads it, is it going to make any sense? Is it really going to convert, those visitors into customers? I would imagine that it comes back to a lot of that when we're talking about being able to make an e-commerce sale, being able to walk a consumer through detail that's going to enable that, because that's what these sites are all about. That's a long-lasting challenge, and that the human mind, Skynet hasn't quite arrived yet. Where, AI is not going to quite be there in that detailed a way anytime soon. And when one of these businesses is trying to catch up, because I think that's where a lot of businesses are. It's that they may have addressed a couple of these things, but in terms of holistic compliance, think there's certainly a way more e-commerce businesses that have not addressed this than that really have. What type of a timeline from the time that they make an informed decision and select any vendors, software solutions to help along the way and keep them organized and help them make sure that they're really achieving their goals to the time that they've really gotten through the process? And I know that that's going to differ greatly
Yeah.
based on the amount of products, the amount of pages, the amount of content, the amount of labor and how specialized within their team. But is there sort of an average project between X weeks and X months that these sorts of projects
My,
take?
my my answer to that would be: is there any average like organization? It's every situation is different. So how I would approach it if I'm a buyer and it's time to address this. First off, you may have to get over the idea of being able to retrofit everything you've got going on. It just may not even be feasible. So at minimum, take a forward looking approach and just say, from this point forward, I'm not going to launch anything that isn't being done right. So at least there, time will at least fix it if you adopt that policy. Number one. The other thing is too, it depends on the solution, the approach you take to it. If you go off and you think that hiring some trinket for the website with AI is going to solve your problem and that's the solution, and then you kick your feet up and wait 6 months for a lawsuit to come in, you've just set yourself back 6 months. So it all depends on whether you do this right from the get-go and you build this in an accessibility program, the management of it into your dev cycle, and you do this right. Assuming you do this right, you don't take the wrong approach, a glass half full approach, a glass completely empty approach, and you do it right, and you're looking at one asset, one average asset, not a complex site, you can certainly with a vendor start getting some excellent feedback on the types of challenges and errors that are embedded in your code. You can get that feedback within a few weeks, and you can start getting to work on it and beginning to remediate this within a few months. If you're really going to put all hands on deck and take a concerted effort to do it, it's important to put an accessibility statement on your site that gives expression to this commitment, that you understand this. This is about the mitigation of the legal risk, and to send a message to the community that, you know what, we know we haven't been perfect historically, but right now we are embarking on, we're building this into our process, and these are the steps we are taking. This is the vendor we have engaged, and that sends a message to everyone like, all right, these guys are serious. This isn't lip service. But if you're just going to put some sort of fake solution on a site thinking that's going to be the cure-all, you're sending a message to the market that not only you're not taking this seriously, you're slapping the user in the face.
That reminds me a lot of, I saw, and I'll admit that I had took some part in adding Google Translate to any number of websites back in the day, not always by choice, but that was all automated. The quality of the content, especially as you were talking about individual products and such that really needed to be described properly, was pretty limited. Was it better than nothing? Perhaps. I mean, today browsers and what have you can do a lot of that. You don't necessarily need to add the Google Translate dropdown to a site or that sort of thing. Was it going to compare to actually having handwritten translations for different languages? Absolutely not. And so I think that there's an amount of that you can put something up there and you can hope that it's going to do something for you. And in the case of that, you also, again, you lose out on fringe benefits like, with Google Translate, you're not hosting different content on your site in different languages. You're not getting any SEO value. It's not helping you to run your Google ads or other advertising in other, in other languages in terms of quality scores and other things that I think it's, if you're trying to advertise and bring in people from a particular community and that's the best that you're going to offer them, that you're going to see pretty limited interest and results and feedback. And I imagine it's very much the same, not a perfect analogy, but it just strikes me as something that the market has tried, and that there's a reason why we don't see that Google Translate dropdown on lots of e-commerce sites today. It's really not what we needed then and not what we need now.
in a similar vein, when you look at the automated captioning that's possible now in YouTube videos, you can automatic cap. So you would think intuitively, oh, that's a great thing. That's wonderful. But a lot of the people in the hearing impaired community, potentially the consensus is it's actually a bad thing. Um, Again, I don't know if I could state that the entire community believes that, but certainly a subset of the community strongly believes that the automated captioning is a bad thing. And you'd think, why? It's some captioning is better than none. Well, because it sends a message that you can rely on this imperfect system, which now sends a message that we don't need to hire real translators who will get the meaning right, and you have a world full of partially poorly transcribed, albeit automated fashion video that is going to really kill the experience. So if Netflix was to use only automated subtitles and captioning, I mean, imagine how horrible it would be following a movie based on what the computer has interpreted. So that's very similar to the translation. You're getting that natural language sort of processing issue interpreting.
That makes perfect sense. And, I mean, I imagine it's probably easiest to address some of these things when rebuilding or migrating or replatforming a website, because at that point you can take a more holistic look at the front end, and design elements, color schemes, fonts, sizes, different things, pretty, because you're going to do that anyway. So it's a good time to deal with that while, dealing with positioning and adding technology and doing so many things that can impact users with a variety of disabilities. And I think you hit on something interesting, that there are going to be some things that without rebuilding a site, depending on what technology was used, how old it is, what the dependencies are, that you might not be able to fully achieve the way that you'd want, until you upgrade or replatform, or at least really, reinvest in. And so I suppose that probably generates, some interesting conversations, and challenges that, as with so many things, I mean, we deal with in e-commerce, a lot of businesses that are using old point of sale software in their retail stores. And, you want to have an omni-channel experience. You want people in the store and online to be able to use the same gift cards, in the same way, and be able to use the same reward points that they're, collecting as part of a loyalty program in the same way. But these systems aren't always, when you're dealing with a system that's decades old in your stores, that becomes challenging. And so, when the website turns out to be the older part of the tech stack, I imagine, that can be just as challenging. I would hope, though, that a lot of the, like we mainly at JetRails deal with open source platforms, of course, as a web host. And so, platforms like Magento are extremely flexible, that, hopefully, yes, there's going to be some lifting to do, but nothing too dastardly in terms of holding a business back from achieving their accessibility and compliance, aspirations. Yeah. So I wonder, we keep talking about accessibility. I know that when I travel in the United States, we've got a lot of regulation around, ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act style compliance, in terms of wheelchair ramps and accessible bathrooms and some of the things that we've touched on. Um, is it, but, in the US, we've been seeing in recent years that some compliance, like data privacy, has been more stringent in other places, like the EU. Uh, when it comes to accessibility compliance, is there a gold standard? Are there places that are maybe the most stringent, or the most advanced in terms of regulation? Or is it all pretty similar internationally?
It definitely varies. You've got a patchwork, and interpretations can vary uh, within nationalities. Where you could have stringent regulations, yet poor enforcement, and then you could have less stringent ones with stronger enforcement. So it's a multifactorial sort of the inputs into that decision. When we speak to an organization, like, this is the right thing to be doing. You need to be doing this. We try to avoid the splitting hairs over what the regs say here, what they don't say there. there's enough out there, enough impetus to basically inform what should be the correct decision. You should be committed to it. Now, if you're dealing with a response with a legal situation, you've been hit with the demand letter, you've been hit with the lawsuit, and oh my God, we can't retrofit all this stuff in all these jurisdictions. Well, then you're going to start taking a prioritized approach in those markets, and you're going to have to make some tough trade-off decisions for certain. But you're seeing Europe has just brought online their Accessibility Act. Brazil's got one. Canada's got multi at the provincial level, at the national level. We've just launched one, and in Ontario, for example, you've got a very well-defined act that goes beyond minimum requirements. It mandates communication supports, but the enforcement is also at the same time very, very poor. The U.S. Has some vagaries in the language, but precedents are overcoming those ambiguities or those gaps and making the message pretty clear on what's required. And the US being the most litigious environment in the world, that of course is ushering in the thrust that we're seeing today and the urgency that's informing it. So yeah, there's the variation, but the world's all heading in the arrow of progress is moving in one direction. And,
Yeah, look, unfortunately, you know, our litigious society here in the States does certainly create problems for merchants and others. But that notwithstanding, and I'll spare the listeners from all the lawyer jokes. And it's good to see this moving forward for its own reasons. I'm going to take a risk here, and I'm going to circle back to something that I want to be able to look at this as something altruistic, something that we should be doing because it should be done. But, and obviously there's that risk that's very hard to, in terms of lawsuits and things, it's, very hard to put numbers to. But have you found that merchants do see some kind of a sales lift or ROI when properly addressing compliance, because now they're able to service more of a market, they're able to get people excited and happy about what they're doing for these communities, outside of, again, things that are much harder to track, like, fringe SEO benefits or anything like that?
Very hard because you'd have to orchestrate an all things equal mutatis mutandi sort of study that you would adjust for it, and the cost of doing these things, there's enough reasons to do this without having to prove it based on I sold 12 more pairs of jeans. Having said all that, we have been able to measure impact in different ways through surveys, through utilization, through feedback. We've come up with some innovative methodologies online to engage customers with disabilities, to solicit their impressions and what's going on. And by those qualitative measures, we've absolutely been able to but you could draw conclusions and extrapolate to larger audience scenarios that there's a measurable impact here that more than justifiably that justifies the investment for the large organization. But it's no, there aren't. I mean, that's a very I love to tell the anecdote of this is a little bit more back in the day, 10 years ago or so. You had three organizations. One would be a pure brick and mortar. So one would be a pure e-commerce shoe seller. The second would be a big traditional brick and mortar shoe seller with like an e-commerce division. And the third would be a pure brick and mortar with just a little website. So think of like a Zappos being pure e-commerce, a Timberland type store with like a e-commerce division and the store. And then you could have like an old school, like a Bata with like, old school shoe with a little website. And you'd say to yourself, which of those organizations do you think is going to take the biggest interest hypothetically in embracing accessibility in the early days? Which would you guess? Where is it going to, which organization would you expect to go first, second, and third if you were to rank them?
Oh, you're going to put me on the spot now.
What would you guess?
Well, you would think that the digital first folks would be putting more focus on their digital channel, but the brick and mortar folks are used to compliance. And so they're more likely, I would imagine, to have compliance officers and other people that are going to, make them aware of things that are going on and that are going to be tracking what's going on from that side. So this could really go for me either way. And whichever one I choose, I'm going to totally lose out here.
Yeah, we would all get this wrong. So yeah,
Yeah.
what you said is exactly what any sentient human would think. But the reality is, the e-commerce, a pure e-commerce provider, historically, has been very impersonal, very click driven. They don't see the human; they just see the click. And so to them, it's all just about clicks. And the problem is, going back to your question of, do you see the uplift? Not to say there's no uplift, but it's very hard for accessibility to compete with Google. At the end of the day, if you could buy one more Google AdWord for $2, or I could put that $2 towards accessibility, accessibility is going to have a big challenge beating Google at its own game. So that kind of answers the question for you. So the pure e-commerce companies had the least interest. The brick and mortar had the most because they know humans. They deal with humans all the time. They're very people centric. So they would be very sympathetic to the need for this. But then you would think, by that logic, then the hybrid organization would be the best because they've got the big brick and mortar, but they've also got the e-commerce, best of both worlds. Well, the problem was, the e-commerce division of a company like that would be struggling. It would be such a frustration for a traditional brick and mortar retailer. Historically, they just didn't want to hear about any more e-commerce related type money pit initiatives. So it's just that the culture of accessibility in the digital world emanates from that legacy history. Now we're seeing though changes though. E-commerce companies are very savvy now. Their workforces are very, very progressive, and that human element is coming to is flourishing increasingly behind the scenes. Like it's not a webmaster culture so much anymore in the pure e-commerce organizations. It's being really humanized and becoming more human, people centric. So
Yeah.
that is changing.
I can recall begging businesses to let us build them mobile responsive front ends for their websites. And I can vividly remember businesses dragging their feet for years, not months, not a year, multiple years. That now, we track our traffic in Google Analytics, and we would look at the data together and look, that the mobile conversion rate is so low that trying to spend more time on that, how's that going to help? But what people had a hard time even processing, it wasn't always just about what we would think of as the last click, as the purchase. So just in earlier days, people were more likely to go to their desktop or what have you to type in their credit card. It was a pain to do on a mobile device. Things have certainly gotten better with digital wallets and lots of other, and biometrics and other things. But the challenge was that there was a shopping journey. And so if you couldn't get the shopper to first engage with the site, to browse through the site to find something, they'd never make it to making that desktop purchase. Of course, today we see more and more purchases just happening native mobile. It varies site to site, industry to industry. It's not quite 50% according to larger aggregate data from big companies like Adobe, but it's on track to be pretty soon. So you can be at the forefront of this trend and capture more customers and increase your brand following and do right by the market, or you can be at the tail end and trying to catch up to everybody else. But I think that's a lot of how I look at accessibility as an individual, is that, the technology has arrived. The ability to achieve this has arrived, and the market is going to expect it more and more. You can be at the forefront or you can be at the tail end. That's up to individual businesses to determine. But my advice would always be stay at the forefront of something like that just makes sense.
Sure. And then another thing too, like just a point to leave everyone off on, it's take the view that it's not an us or them thing. People stereotypically kind of look at disability that way. And so you got to take the view that, we all have a disability in the long run. It's only a matter of when. Like something like 50% of people over the age of 70 have some form of disability. We wear glasses. That's, a light form of vision impairment. So it's just take the view that almost be selfish about it. Like, think of your own needs. Like, what would they be? What would you expect in a situation like that? And just personalize it more, just to get to assume that perspective and not take this kind of like it's an alien mindset. Like, oh, that's for somebody else with with a different requirement that I can't relate to. Like, that's just, again, that's a very legacy way of thinking.
Absolutely. I sat on the board of a nonprofit school for kids with special needs for years. I was president of the board, and that was one of the toughest challenges that we had. Was that there were uh, nonprofits and charities and things that were very easy for people to get behind, but if you didn't have someone that was affected by autism, cerebral palsy, something that the school was there to address. Uh, it was hard sometimes to get people who hadn't visited the school or hadn't been to one of our events to just intrinsically understand what the value was and why they should be behind it, and why, as a community, we needed to be behind things like it. That's obviously on a micro level, as opposed to dealing with things, nationally and internationally as a macro, uh, thing. But at the same time, these are people's lives, and so quality of life, I think, for us, our neighbors, our communities, is always something that we can and should strive for. Um, Simon, I think this has been a pretty eye-opening episode for us over here at Jet Rails. I think our team's really going to enjoy sharing this one. Not that we don't normally, but in particular. Do you have any final thoughts, words of wisdom, things coming down the pike? Anything else to add before we wrap it up for the day?
Just, you know what, hopefully we've persuaded you of the necessity here. And for those of you who are already doing it, take a methodical approach. Don't get hoodwinked. There's a lot of bogus sort of offerings on the marketplace. It's not an easy thing for sure. We're not going to tell you it's a quick one and done type area. Hopefully we've got that point across. And just don't take a failed approach. Make sure you get a credible vendor that's really going to give you the guidance you require to do this right. And it's a combination of people and technology.
Awesome. Well, to our listeners, as always, thanks for tuning in. Simon, we really appreciate your time today and all your insights. And for anyone that wants to continue to see more great content like this, we've got a lot more coming out. So be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts or wherever you're seeing this video. And we'll wish you happy selling.